Hello everyone, my name is Steven. All my childhood I dreamed of a dog, but my parents were against it since we lived in an apartment and my mother was afraid that the pet would bring a lot of trouble. I tried to persuade them for many years and then one day they suddenly agreed. It seemed strange to me, but I was happy. And then I realized why it happened. Now I will tell you everything, and you will understand. But first I want to ask you to like my story, write comments under the video, express your opinion, and subscribe to the channel. I'm sure there are many more amazing stories waiting for you here. So, as I said, all my childhood I dreamed of a dog. Before, when I was very young, we lived in a private house, where we had our own yard and my father got a dog. Its name was Penny. I adored this dog. She was a surprisingly intelligent dog. She even saved my life once. The black shepherd dog, despite the breed, was very kind. It never bit people, did not rush, and did not growl unnecessarily. Penny liked to be taken for a walk. She was only partial to squirrels. They irritated her terribly. And on one of these walks in the park, she again saw a rodent in a tree. The squirrel ate nuts and didn't touch anyone, and then Penny took off. She chased right after the squirrel, started jumping at the tree, barking, trying to get it, but it didn't work. I was with my dad at the time. My dad was on the phone and didn't pay attention to the dog. I ran very close. I wanted to drive the dog away, but it jumped, and then it hit me. I fell to the ground and began to cry. She scratched my face. I knew it was an accident, but my father, seeing me with blood on my face, was afraid. He punished Penny, put her in an orphanage, and then we moved to another city and rented an apartment. From that day on, the talk about dogs stopped. I was terribly sad. I did not want to give it away because of the absurdity, but my pleas were ignored. Mom thought the dog was mad. Another argument was that we no longer have a yard. In general, so many years have passed, and now I turned 13 years old. I'm stubborn, so every Christmas and birthday I ordered a dog as a gift. I knew my parents wouldn't listen, but I couldn't help it. That's how much I love dogs. My father would sometimes swear, get angry, like stop saying the same thing, but what could I do about it? Time went on, and there was less and less hope. I already began to dream that when I grow up and rent an apartment on my own, I will definitely buy a pet and call it either Lucky or Batty. But just in case, before his 13th birthday, he asked for a dog again. At that time, my mother did not feel well. She constantly had a headache. She quickly got tired and almost did not eat anything. I couldn't understand why she was sick, but my mother said it was a cold. But does a cold last that long? My mother was ill for about 6 months. My father was always in his thoughts. Our family was no longer as fun as it used to be, and I couldn't understand why. So, when Dad asked about the gift and heard dog, he got mad. Yes, how much can I do? We won't buy you an animal. Remember that once and for all. This is not a good time at all, so no dog. Do you understand? He screamed as hard as ever, and I realized that I had already had enough of my whims. I was upset by my father's tone. I was offended, but then my mother came up. She was weak, but she found the strength to feel sorry for me. Mom asked Dad not to yell, and then called him into the bedroom to talk. I heard a loud argument on his part, but my mother was saying something to him in a low voice. Anyway, the next day I came home from school. It was my birthday, and there was a little pug dog waiting for me on the doorstep, wagging his tail, and my parents were standing behind me. I shouted, threw my bag on the floor, and grabbed the dog. Batty, I shouted. I remember I even wanted to cry because it was the gift of a lifetime. I couldn't believe the happiness. It was so cool. The dog was already an adult. She was about 1.5 years old. The father said that he bought her colleagues, like they no longer needed her. Batty immediately got used to me. He slept on my bed. I walked him several times a day. He met me after school and saw me off. He never littered the house. He knew the rules of behavior, because before that he also lived in the house. He was a ready-trained dog and my best friend. Too busy with the dog, I even forgot to ask why my parents decided to give it to me. I also thought that if I asked, he would be given back, so I was silently happy. Batty stayed with us for a couple of weeks, and then my friend Tim asked me to go with him to the hospital to see his sister. He told me that his sister was ill, that she slept a lot, ate little, and hardly got out of bed. My mother has the same thing. It's such a flu, but it's strange that it lasts too long. I tried to explain to my friend, but he shrugged and said, I hope so. When we got to the hospital, they didn't want to let us in with a dog for a long time, but I was sure that the dogs were treating us, and it would be good for Sister Tim to play with Batty. I put it in my backpack and we went to her room and closed the doors. When I saw Hannah, that was her name, I was afraid. I didn't recognize her. Tim, too, seemed to have fallen into a stupor. She had no hair. Then we realized that it wasn't the flu. There was something wrong with her. At first, we just talked, and then I opened my backpack and Batty jumped out. He began to spin around Hannah, sniffing her, and then barking loudly. I tried to calm him down, but he was restless. Hannah was smiling, kissing the dog, and he was sniffing her so carefully. I thought he just liked her, but then Tim started sobbing. I was very surprised by this. "Tim, what's wrong with you?" I asked, but he wouldn't let up. And then, in a trembling voice, I asked, "Hannah, do you have cancer?" I was shocked, but how did he know? Hannah started crying too, and then said yes, that's why she's in the hospital. After we left the hospital, I asked Tim how he knew, and he said, "It's because of your dog. Apparently she is trained. I have seen such dogs. I know how they behave when they find a disease. Hannah has had such dogs before." And then the images began to change convulsively in my temples. I immediately remembered my mother, her symptoms. They were similar to those of Tim's sister, and yet they never picked up Batty, and he also barked, circled around her, and sniffed at her. My face turned pale. I took the dog and ran home, saying a quick goodbye to my friend. The first thing I did was run into my mother's bedroom, where my father was sitting, and he brought her tea. I didn't even say hello to them. I ignored my father's questions like how I was doing and what was wrong with me. I let go of the dog and Batty jumped on my mother's bed, sniffed at her, and then began to bark loudly, spinning around her. My lips trembled, and I began to cry. Mom and Dad got scared, chased the dog out the door, and asked what was wrong with me. "Mom, do you have cancer?" My mother was silent. Her eyes were round with surprise. My father was looking at the floor, and I understood everything. "Is that why you bought me a dog, so that I wouldn't notice how sick my mother is?" I asked again, and tears came to my mother's eyes. It was terrible, and I couldn't bear the thought that my mother would soon be gone. I asked her why she wasn't in the hospital, but my mother said she didn't want me to know and refused treatment. I immediately shouted that she had no right to give up. In general, it was a long conversation. I cried bitterly and tried to persuade my mother to start treatment. In the end, I managed to get my way. We put my mother in the hospital and she started receiving chemotherapy. We went to see her every day. I will not tell you what we all had to go through, but after 1.5 years, my mother became much better. And the next time we went to the hospital with Batty, he wasn't hanging around and barking at her. He just laid down next to me and fell asleep. When the doctor came in and said that my mother was in remission, we managed to beat cancer for a while, and it was beautiful. We were so happy. Since then, we've all lived together, and Dad, by the way, then bought another dog. We named it Hope, which means expectation. So dogs are our best loyal friends, and they also give us the opportunity to live. Hi everyone, my name is Rima. You know, I have a certain peculiarity. Yes, I am not exactly like all children. I am noticeably different from them, and my peculiarity can be easily seen. Now I'll tell you what it's about, but in the meantime, get settled, put likes, and listen further. As a result, I was born the third child in a row. In addition to me, there are 2 more children, a brother and a sister. I was born relatively late. My parents were 38 years old when I was born. As my mother said, she was waiting for me more than anyone else, because it was she who wanted a child very much. So I got it. It seems that the whole pregnancy went well. The doctors did not say anything bad. And when I was born, everything went well too. Only a couple of hours later, when my mother brought me to feed, the doctor asked if she saw something special about me. My mother did not immediately understand what was being said. "Your baby doesn't have ears," the nurse said. My mother asked again and did not believe her words. She thought that the doctor was confused, that nothing like this can be. Everything was normal, right? But she took off her hat and gasped. She saw me, her son, and I was really without ears. Instead, they were like small appendages sticking out of the head. My mother cried bitterly, and then called the neonatologists. Several doctors gathered in the ward and all began to examine me. A few minutes later, my mother was told that I really have underdeveloped ears, such a pathology, and so far nothing can be done about it, because I am too small. My mother was upset again. She didn't know how I would be able to hear or if I would be able to do it at all. I don't think I'll grow up to be a defective child and all that, but the doctors reassured my mother. They asked her not to panic and not to give up ahead of time, because everything can be solved in our modern world. Then my mother heard a sharp cry from her roommate. The woman who was in the same room with her learned the terrible news. It turned out that her newborn son was found to have a brain tumor, and it is huge. The woman was hysterical, because this is a serious fatal disease. The baby did not really have time to be born, and already has to fight with such an evil disease. At that moment, my mother realized that my diagnosis, my pathology, is nothing compared to what happens to people. In the end, we were released from the hospital and came home. But there was something else waiting for us. My older siblings were very happy with me. They circled around me, kissed me, and wanted to touch me all the time. My mother cried with happiness, and then decided to show my head. She took off hat, and the siblings froze. They didn't know how to react and asked if it was normal. My mother hastened to reassure them, saying that everything is fine. I was just born so special. At this moment, my father came up and looked at me almost with disgust. He immediately threw his mother a scandal and began to look for the culprit. But my mother said that this happens and no one is to blame. When my father ran out of indignation, he began to blame my mother for this. It's like all because she gave birth and an old age and all that. My mother started crying, and my father said he wouldn't even touch me. Since then, the quarrels in the house have not subsided. They fought every day. Dad didn't want to look at me, he didn't recognize me, and he didn't like me at all, in any way. In the end, he and my mother divorced, and my mother moved to another city from him. This added to the difficulties in our lives, but my mother understood that it was for the best. After all, she was the only one who really wanted the last child, not her husband. Dad was happy to disappear. He did not help the other children, let alone me. That's how we lived. It was good that my mother had a remote job, a small grocery store, and a bank account, which was enough for us to live. Over time, I grew up and people around me had a lot of questions about my appearance. My mother answered everyone politely at first, and then there were even more questions. And we realized that the more patient and polite you are to answer the curious, the more tactless questions they ask. So we decided to respond rudely and harshly. I bit them off, my mother would say. People immediately rejected it, but they didn't ask anything else. When I went to kindergarten, the children started asking me questions. I was embarrassed, but I tried to answer as best I could. By the way, yes, my hearing was almost not affected. I, of course, did not hear so well, but I still heard. Then my mother and I came up with a hairstyle that would hide my ears from the eyes. I grew my hair a little longer and walked like this almost all my life. I went to school with the same hairstyle. Of course, it was always impossible to hide it. Well, at least passers-by didn't see it, and that's good. Personally, I was also stressed out by my quits. I really wanted to wear headphones. It is normal to hear and to do other hairstyles. I wanted girls to like me and ask them out, but I had a complex pathology. I began to read a lot about my case on the internet and realized that I was not the only one. I found guys with the same diagnosis and talked to them for a while. As a result, I found a clinic where they perform surgery to restore the auricle. True, it was a complex and expensive operation, but I really wanted it. My mother agreed, but we could not raise money because we were so tight with money. And every time my mother said I was beautiful, I didn't believe her. If I was beautiful, my father wouldn't have left because of me, I told her. I continued to live with complexes and already began to hate myself. And then something incredible happened. I suddenly got a phone call and was invited to come to a trial photo shoot of a clothing line. I thought it was a hoax and didn't agree, but they sent an official email to me. From there, I found out that someone submitted a resume for me to be a model for one of the brands and they agreed. I'm just freaking out. Mom was happy, but she had no idea who did it. Of course, I often heard compliments addressed to me, but I considered them unfair, because it was said by people who did not see my ears. In general, I came to the casting and I was hired. I didn't expect this turn of events at all. I was told that I had to go through training and sign a contract. In the end, I asked about my feature, but the editor of the magazine said that it would be my business card and my whole feature. To be honest, I had to spend a lot of time trying to pass off my complexes as achievements and even make them my own chip. But if this is how fate turned out, then why not? So I started my career, I posed for magazines, and then I was invited to the catwalks. My first exit took place 5 months after the start of my career, and this was considered a good indicator. And you know, I was approached by a man who finally tapped me on the shoulder, hugged me, and then called me son. Yes, it was my father. It turned out that it was he who submitted the resume on my behalf. He saw my photos online and decided to make amends. He had just been fired from his job, kicked out of the house by his new wife, and had nowhere to go. I felt sorry for him, but I remembered my mother's tears and sleepless nights. so I gave him half of the evening's fees, patted him on the shoulder, and left. From that moment on, I felt better and stopped holding on to the past. Well, my career continues successfully.